The purpose of this module is to provide an overview of self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is a major theory of human motivation and helps us to understand what is likely to help people pursue goals and also keep pursuing them even when they get difficult. This is a theory that's woven throughout the Pivot experience in our app, and it is also a really critical part of coaching. So when we think about motivation, we often think about motivation in terms of motivational quantity. So for example, in the lesson on the trans-theoretical model, you learned a lot about the difference between people who are kind of in pre-contemplation, they're not really that into making a change, versus those who are all the way in the space of action or maintenance. This is primarily a model of motivational quantity. Self-determination theory addresses not only how much a person is motivated, but why or how they are motivated, so really focusing on motivational quality. And you can think of motivational quality as falling under kind of these three general umbrellas, and we'll unpack each of these in just a moment. Amotivation is when somebody is not particularly motivated to change. We'll talk about that toward the end of this module. Extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation are probably terms you're familiar with and are typically things that people think about when they think about motivation and especially motivational quality. But one of the things that self-determination theory does a really excellent job of is unpacking the different forms of extrinsic motivation, because there are some forms of extrinsic motivation that are a little bit closer to intrinsic motivation, even if we can't quite get to that promised land. So if we think about motivation as falling along a continuum of relatively external to relatively more internal, you can see that presented here in this diagram. Here we're going to talk about a lot of very technical theoretical terms. You aren't going to be quizzed or tested on the particulars of each of these terms. What's most important is that you understand what these types of motivation mean conceptually and how you might see these show up in our Pivot participants. So the relatively more internal forms of motivation you can see above this dashed line. These are the types of motivation that are more likely to result in longer-term behavior change. And that's really important when we're thinking about something like quitting smoking, because we don't want somebody to just quit smoking for a day. We want them to quit smoking for life. And then those types of motivation that are below the dashed line, those are the types of motivation that might get somebody started, but are often harder to maintain over time. And so if those are the primary drivers of someone's behavior or behavior change, that may set them up for some challenges when challenges with making behavior change arise. So let's dive in just a little bit more with each of these different types of motivation that are along the motivation continuum. We'll start first by talking about these two forms of controlled or external motivation, and then we'll move into talking about the autonomous or internal forms of motivation. First up is external regulation, and this is going to sound super familiar to you. These are the situations where people are feeling pressured from outside. So these are things like when somebody's doctor has been nagging them about quitting, maybe very well-intentioned spouse or friends or other loved ones, or when an insurance company or a wellness program is particularly punitive. For example, when they charge a tobacco surcharge or make people pay higher insurance premiums because they're smokers. So things to listen for in our Pivot participants that might signal to you that there is some external motivation going on here is when you hear them say things like, I don't really have a choice, I have to be in this program. I'm not doing this because I want to. Or I just want my kid, my wife, my husband, my friend to stop nagging me about this. But people can also have external motivation that comes from within themselves. And this is where we get into the topic of kind of shoulding, when people feel pressured from inside, when they feel guilt or shame about doing or not doing a certain behavior. And here are some things to listen for that might signal to you that a person has a bit of this introjected regulation going on. Things like, I really should just quit already. I'd feel so bad if I got sick from smoking. I don't know what's wrong with me, other people quit. And this comes up quite a bit because at this point, it's not a surprise to anyone that smoking is bad for your health. And so people know that it's something that they need to change or that they should change. And they also recognize that there are consequences for not changing. But if all that's operating for this person is that feeling of guilt or shame, or that there's something wrong with them because they've not been able to quit already, that can be a really hard place for them to be in terms of sustaining that behavior over time. So now we're going to move into talking about these more internal forms of motivation. And we'll talk about both integrated and identified regulation together. So this is when people feel that they've connected to the behavior as something that's really important to them, not that's important to someone else, but that's really important to them, and or that is consistent with something else they value. So for example, you might hear a person say, quitting smoking is really important to me, or this is an important goal for me. You might also hear people talk about things around identity, like I think of myself as a healthy person and quitting is part of that. Or you might also hear people talk about some of the bigger picture goals and values in their life. Oftentimes this is tied to close personal relationships. Things like, I want to spend time with my family and keep up with my kids. So those are the types of things that you might hear from somebody who has this type of motivation activated. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about intrinsic regulation or intrinsic motivation here. The reality is that quitting smoking is probably not going to fall into this category because quitting smoking is not something that people generally enjoy. It's hard and it's uncomfortable, and it's not something that they do just because they want to quit smoking. They're typically quitting smoking for some other outcome, like they want to improve their health, they want to spend time with their family, and so forth. Intrinsic motivation is when people are engaging in a behavior simply because they find that behavior enjoyable and interesting in its own right. The closest we are likely to get to this is when we hear people say things like, quitting smoking is an interesting challenge, or I want to challenge myself to try this thing out. Or things like, figuring out which tools work best for me and my quit plan is like solving a puzzle. So those are probably the closest we'll ever get to seeing intrinsic regulation and smoking cessation, but we wanted to be sure that you had that in mind. Now, we talked about each of these 4 types of motivation, or these types of extrinsic motivation in particular, as if they exist in isolation. The reality is that for most of the people, most of the time, they're probably going to have multiple forms of motivation operating. And so your job as a coach is to listen for what types of motivation come up most often and what seems to be the loudest in that choir of motivation for the user. So now we'll talk a little bit about amotivation. So amotivation is when people have relatively little or no action or intention to behave. So using the trans-theoretical model, we would refer to this as pre-contemplation. One of the things that's most important when we see that a pivot user is not motivated to change is to think and explore with them a bit more about why that is. Because why they're not motivated is going to be really important information for you to have as you start to think about strategies for how to engage them, to think about how smoking fits into their lives. So there are 3 main reasons why someone may not be motivated. One is that quitting smoking may not be important to them, or there may be other things that are higher priority. As a coach, you will hear people talk not only about smoking and smoking cessation, but they'll talk about the rest of their lives, and you will hear that the rest of their lives are often very complicated. And so there may be other things going on for them that are a higher priority. Second, another reason that people may not be motivated to change is they may not believe that they have the ability to make the change. Most of the people who come to our program have tried to quit smoking before, and so they've had not only the experience of maybe getting through days, weeks, months, or even years smoke-free, but they've also had the experience of being disappointed with failing to be able to sustain that over time. And sometimes when people feel really defeated or deflated about their ability to do something, they just can't muster the energy that they need to try to make the change. A third reason that people may not be motivated is closely related to the second, and this is that people may not believe that they would be successful even if they tried. And again, it's important to keep in mind that these different reasons are likely to require different strategies for you as a coach as you think about how smoking and quitting smoking might fit into a pivot participant's life. So, one of the things you might be thinking is, okay, this all sounds real great, but how is it that we get people from having less of those external forms of motivation to having more of those internal forms of motivation? And the good news is that you as a coach have a set of tools and resources that will help you to support people in developing these more high quality forms of motivation. And that is through supporting what self-determination theory has deemed 3 basic psychological needs. The first is the need for autonomy. This is the need for people to feel choiceful, like they're the one driving the bus. Now, this doesn't mean that you leave your user to flounder. If they are coming to you and seeking your advice, or if they seem to be struggling, absolutely please provide advice and direction for them. But it does mean that it's important to think about coaching and the coaching relationship as a partnership, where the person who's really driving the experience is the user because they're their own best expert. The second is the need for competence, and I hinted at this a little bit earlier when we were talking about amotivation. This is the need to feel capable and optimally challenged. So people, first of all, need to have some degree of confidence in their ability to quit smoking. But one thing that we've seen a lot of pivot participants do is that sometimes they want to try to reduce before they quit. And this can be a good way to help them build confidence and to feel like they really can do this by challenging themselves to go from smoking, say, 20 cigarettes a day to 17 cigarettes a day to 14 cigarettes a day, and so forth. And finally is the need for relatedness. And this is a fundamental human need. We all need to feel understood and valued. And it's really important for our Pivot users to feel like you as their coach understand them as a person and understand the purpose for them being in Pivot and understand the role that smoking plays in their life. And smoking may play a positive role in their lives, and it's important for you to be open to hearing that information. So how does this look in practice? This slide presents an overview of some of the key ways that you can support autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I'll pause here for you to have time to read this. You'll, of course, always have an opportunity to come back to these slides. And finally, here are some examples of how you might see motivation appear in conversations with Pivot users. Take a look at each of the examples here and identify the type of motivation the user is displaying in the statements, using external or internal. What I'll highlight for you here is the example in the upper right-hand corner. This is an actual quote from an actual Pivot user. She says, "My plan had been to quit before my daughter was old enough to understand. She's now 5 and sometimes she'll say, 'Are you going outside to smoke, Mommy?' I'm concerned about my health because I want to be around to see her grow up. I want to be there for her milestones. It's scary to think about voluntarily doing something that can kill you. I feel controlled because I'd give up time with my family to be outside by myself smoking." What's so powerful about this particular quote is that it highlights a lot about what this user values. This is a person who values being respected and honored by her child. This is also a person who is clearly stating that she's concerned about her health and how smoking is impacting her health, but she's also recognizing that smoking is disrupting something that's really important to her, and that is having time with friends and family, that smoking takes her away from that. So these are just some examples of how you might see these principles from self-determination theory existing in practice, and how you as a coach can help to use those pieces of information to craft a quality coaching experience that meets the user where they are motivationally, and that also helps them to garner and develop those sources of motivation that are likely to lead to lasting behavior change.